I want to start out with a quote from one of my favorite books. It's right here, Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Quote, "We can detect fragility, see it, and even in many cases measure it." And then he goes on. "You cannot say with any reliability that a certain remote event or shock is more likely than another, unless you enjoy deceiving yourself. But you can state with a lot more confidence that an object or structure is more fragile than another should a certain event happen." End quote. Now, when you dig a little bit and you look at the implications within this quote, it's profound. This quote is saying that it's nearly futile and it's even deceptive to try predicting widespread disasters or shocks, right? I'm talking about future financial collapses or wars or famines, droughts, natural disasters, etc. These events are too random and too complex to predict with any accuracy. But just because we can't predict doesn't mean we can't measure. Honestly, I believe it's wholly irresponsible not to measure how fragile or resilient you are. Everyone should be measuring how fragile they are to the unknowable future. And this includes groups of people, such as societies and cities and communities and families. Because as the business leader Peter Drucker once said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, right? So to reduce fragility and increase resiliency, you and I must figure out a way to measure it. And in our society, we do see this. There are many ways to measure fragility, okay? For example, there are entire groups of people around the world who track national debts, right? Because they see that high amounts of national debt, they equate to a higher level of risk of default and currency collapse. And heck, even the personal credit score is kind of a measure of financial fragility or resiliency. Not quite, because you have to have debts to have a score. I mean, if you don't use debt, you don't get a credit score. And actually, if you don't need debt, you're actually more resilient than somebody who does need debt. So, the credit score is kind of like an I love debt score, not really a resiliency thing, but I think you get my point. And able to find success in any endeavor, you have to have some sense of where you're at and where you want to go. And that means measurement. So knowing this, I have a question for you. What's your family's resiliency score? What? You don't know it? You haven't measured it yet? Well, that's a shame, because we all get affected once in a while by turmoil, right? Daily job losses. Some people get home invasions, break-ins, prolonged power outages happen to people in the middle of the winter or the middle of the summer. Local droughts and tornadoes and weather systems come through. On top of financial crises that come and go because of national debts or because of inflation, right? These are all crises or turmoils that come and go, and we have to be able to ride these out. And people who are more resilient can ride those out without as many adverse effects to their lives, while people who are less resilient, those who are fragile, well, they suffer. So figuring out how resilient or fragile you are or your family is to the future is a critical thing that we all should be doing. It just makes sense. And then once you figure out that number, you can then decide whether you're comfortable with that. And if you're not, you can finally do something about it. You see, very few people take the time to measure their family's fragility or resiliency. And I think that's one of the big reasons why most people end up in a high-risk category that I call the fragile masses. These are the people that are going through life on autopilot. They have lots of debt, and they feel no obligation to become more resilient at all. And instead, they seek a never-ending sea of more comfort and more luxuries and just more stuff. Content to be ignorant about this, or they'll just assume others will step in and save them when disaster strikes, right? People who are choosing personal irresponsibility over resiliency. Perhaps it's because they think it's too complicated or too confusing, but I think it's due to a widespread lack of awareness. Our culture's lazy and it's distracted and it's focused on immediate gratification. And they're fragile virtues. They're not resilient ones. And I think it's way past time to wake up, to change our fragile mindset. And it all starts with calculating your resiliency with actual numbers to see your ability to overcome future hardships or not. That's why I've developed something called the Readiness score. The Readiness score is a way to see where you and your family stand up on the fragile versus resilient spectrum. What makes up the Readiness score? Well, the readiness score is made up of several factors related to resiliency. It consists of your strategic backups, your skill sets, plus your physical, mental, and emotional states. Because you need a combination of all these to move from fragile to resilient. For example, perhaps you have lots of backups, but maybe you're still fragile because you don't have any skills, or you're not physically, mentally, and emotionally tough. Or maybe you're tough as hell mentally with lots of skills, but you also don't have any strategic backups. So you're still at a significant disadvantage, right? Now, before I go any further, I want to make this clear. This is not doomsday prepping, okay? Yes, doomsday preppers, they're very resilient, but they've also made some really extreme sacrifices to achieve such a high level of resiliency. For example, many people in that category are willing to move to a remote cabin in the woods or stockpile 3 or 5 years worth of food. And those are not actions everyone finds reasonable, including me. Sure, they'll outlive me and nearly everyone else in the end of the world as we know it scenario. But if such an event ever comes to pass, perhaps life won't be worth living. You know, pop culture likes to make such desperate, hard living intriguing and even romantic, in books and movies. But the truth is, such a world would be a terrible place to live. Instead, you can achieve easily a reasonable state of resiliency, and it doesn't require you to prepare for doomsday. It's all about building your family's resilience to the most likely adverse events you're going to see in your lifetime. The bad stuff that happens to us folks every day, plus maybe a few of the more scary scenarios, such as a famine or a war or a crisis such as that, and be able to ride that out. In history, it's essentially one traumatic event after another, right? That's what history books cover, all the bad stuff that happened throughout the centuries. But none of those historical lessons, none have been extinction level for humans, at least not yet. Now, using history as a guide makes some sense, right? It gives us some idea of what to prepare for. But I also realize that using history to prepare for future events does have a fatal flaw. For one, we should never assume future emergencies and disasters will never exceed past disasters. Why? Because every past largest disaster ever exceeded all previous past disasters, right? So there's no guarantee that the future disasters won't exceed past ones. It's basic logic, but people who try to predict the future, they're often using this historical data, but that's a mistake. This is another reason why predictions often fail and mislead. Predictions are usually based on historical worst-case scenarios, but who's to say the future won't be even worse than the past? And many people make a compelling argument that due to the interconnectedness of our current world, the next disaster will likely exceed past ones. So becoming more resilient doesn't mean you're bulletproof from any future event. Instead, I'm talking about common sense actions every adult should put in place for disasters that will most likely see in our lifetimes. For example, everyone, I think, should have a bare minimum of 1 week's worth of non-perishable food and potable water. But honestly, while 1 week's better than nothing, 1 month is way more resilient, like 4 times more resilient. And calculating how much backup food or water you have, it's not rocket science. You can measure how many shelf-stable calories you have and roughly how long it will last. And if you need help with this, I have a chart to help you estimate what your daily calorie needs are based on your age and your activity level. So just click the link in the description below and share your best email with us and we'll send it over to you. And once you know your family's daily calorie needs, right? You just take each person and you add them together and you have what your family needs each day. Then you can figure out how many calories you need on any given time scale, right? You just multiply that number by 7 for a week or 30 for a month or 365 for a year. And you compare that number to how many you have in your stock. Then you can decide if what you have is currently enough or not, right? Whether you have the resources and the storage space is another thing you need to figure out. But you should be thinking, how do I get from 1 week to 1 month? But if you're not even measuring where you currently are, you won't honestly know how fragile you are. And more importantly, you won't feel any real sense of urgency to improve. Again, people won't improve what they're not measuring. So you can do this calculation for more resources than just food and water. You can also take stock of your other critical supplies, such as your medical kits, your backup heat sources, such as your wood stove wood pile or kerosene fuel, or your Mylar blankets, backup electrical devices, your generators, your hand crank radios, your solar chargers, your self-defense tools and devices, your self-defense skills, home defense systems, escape supplies and plans, DIY skills and knowledge. Do you have critical supplies on hand? Do you have enough of them? And do you know how to use them? By taking stock and answering just a few of these questions, you can get a relatively accurate picture of how resilient or fragile you are. And if you do this, you'll quickly discover if you're part of the fragile masses or not. And if you are, you can now finally do something about it. And here's the good news. I created a program called The Resilient Life. This program helps you track your readiness score automatically, and it gives you a plan step by step to go from being part of the fragile masses to become part of the resilient few. The plan consists of weekly challenges that we'll send you and success badges you can try to achieve. And as you complete challenges and you complete success badges, you'll automatically improve your readiness score. And the Resilient Life is also full of other like-minded members who are working their way towards being more resilient as well. People who are engaged and ready to help motivate you and inspire you or just answer some of your questions. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, please click the link in the description below to find out more. And until next time, prepare, adapt, and overcome.